They called me useless, and my daughter didn't even lower her voice. She said it at the head table beside the man she had just married, with the champagne sweating in the glasses, and the photographer hovering to catch a laugh that didn't belong to me, and the word landed on my chest like a stone I'd been carrying for years and only now recognized by its proper name. I am 72. I live in a rented cottage that leans a little toward the sea, as if listening for gossip, and the front room smells faintly of salt and old wood, and there is a chair by the window where I drink my tea and choose, with deliberate care, which memories I will make room for, and which I will set outside like boxes after a long move. I was not always here. Not always this still. And if you look closely, you can see the place on my ring finger where a band used to sit, and the faint half-moon scar on my thumb from when my daughter was 5, and I was cutting the tags off a Halloween costume. She changed her mind about 3 times because the wings tickled her shoulders, and I remember thinking in that cramped kitchen with the peeling rooster wallpaper that motherhood was mostly about holding your breath and keeping the scissors steady. The wedding came dressed in gold and certainty, as if a life could be ordered like a cake from a glossy brochure. And I let it happen because I had promised myself that if I gave my daughter one unarguable thing, one perfect day, one table where she didn't have to count, one aisle she could walk without glancing over her shoulder for a bill, then maybe the old tenderness would step out from behind the furniture and surprise us both. So I wrote checks with a careful hand and folded receipts like tiny treaties and kept them in a tin on the top shelf next to the spare light bulbs. And when people asked about budgets, I smiled as if I spoke that language fluently. Though the truth was, I was translating every figure back into the years I had saved. For the morning of the ceremony, my cottage looked like a florist, fainted on the floor. Roses yawning open in pale mouths. Eucalyptus breathing its cool medicine into the air. Ribbon unspooling across the table like the veins of a small river. And I stood there in my dress that wasn't new but was honest and pressed, smoothing the hem the way my mother taught me. And I told myself to be useful in the right ways. Stand where they put you. Smile when the camera clicks. Do not reach to fix a slipping strap. Unless you are asked, do not fuss. Do not claim space. Do not make your love visible enough that anyone mistakes it for a need. I arrived early because that is how women like me tell the world we are reliable. I handed the pastry chef the extra envelope because the cake had turned into a tower with edible gold somewhere in the process of becoming a memory worth posting. And I watched my daughter come down the stairs like a bell that refused to be rung, beautiful and a little frightened, the way brides sometimes look when they realize they have arranged a spectacle, and still, stubbornly, remain themselves inside it. And I felt the old ache of wanting to be the person she turned to when the clasp on something delicate gave way, the one who knew how to fix without being seen fixing. People arrived in soft clouds of perfume and opinions. The band tuned in a corner. The coordinator clicked across the floor, making lists taller than she was, and I hovered at the edge of usefulness, like a coat about to be taken or put back on, waiting for a hand to claim me either way. And when my daughter brushed past me to fiddle with the place cards, I caught the scent of hairspray and lilies and the faint metallic edge of nerves, and I whispered, because I could not help myself, "Do you need a pin, darling?" And she gave me a smile as thin as ribbon and said, "We're fine, Mom. Just enjoy." And the word enjoy sat in my mouth, like something you swallow for other people. I found my seat, and it said, Mother of the Bride, in a font that had clearly been rehearsed. And around it were names I had heard more often in stories than in living rooms. And I prepared myself for small talk, the way a swimmer steals for a cold plunge. The speeches began, and they were attractive in the way of speeches that have been written to look like sincerity, and I heard in them a version of my daughter that had learned to edit her life the way people edit photographs, warmly and without contradiction, and I kept my hands folded in my lap so no one would see the tremor that comes not from age, but from a feeling trying very hard to stay polite. When the insult came, it arrived the way storms do on the coast, in a sky that had been flirting with blue all afternoon. A bridesmaid tripped on a hem, the band missed a beat, the new husband leaned down to adjust the microphone stand. Someone laughed too loud at a joke that wasn't quite safe, and in that thin air of almosts, my daughter turned toward me because I had stood up to help collect the gifts into a neater pile so no one would knock them over. And she said it with a little shrug toward the coordinator. Don't worry, she's useless. As if it were a kindness to lower expectations for everyone, as if someone had asked a question that required classification and not a mother. And for a moment, the room tilted and then righted itself because I have good sea legs after all these years, and I set the box down as gently as if it were the last fragile thing I owned. I have learned something about humiliation. It is not a fire, though the cheeks argue otherwise. It is a weight, and it seasons the air. The fork feels heavier, the chair sounds tired when it scrapes back. Even your breath drags a little, as if your ribs have decided to make a point. So I did what women like me do. I gathered the napkins that had fluttered to the floor like losing tickets, and I smiled at the aunt who didn't know where the restrooms were. And I told the waiter, who looked 17, that he was doing just fine even when he spilled. And I would have stayed like that, leaning against the day with both hands the way you hold a stubborn door, if not for the way the insult kept echoing without anyone choosing to quiet the room. People did what people do when cruelty decides to be efficient. They glanced away. They re-poured their drinks. They let the band rescue us with music so loud it erased the need for sentences. I remembered other rooms. The emergency ward waiting area at 2 a.m. when my daughter was 12 and had sprained her ankle doing a cartwheel to show off to girls who didn't know her yet. The principal's office when she was 17 and came home with a broken heart and a report card with more honesty than she could survive that week. The rented hall for her college graduation party, where the ceiling leaked on the potato salad, and we moved all the folding tables under a banner that said congratulations in letters that refused to line up. Those rooms were ugly and sincere and full of elbows and somebody's crying baby, and they loved us better than this gleaming place with its sponsored floral decisions and its cruelty trimmed to fit the centerpieces. I thought of the years I had believed my usefulness was the safest disguise for my love, because asking to be seen felt like a favor. You should not request more than once. And I realized what a small life that is, and how tired it makes you without ever letting you rest. The photographer came and asked for just one with Mom, and I stood beside my daughter at an approved angle, and she leaned without leaning, and the flash strobed, and I made the face women make when they want to look like they believe in outcomes, and then the room slid back into its choreography with the ease of a rehearsal that has done its job. By the time the cake arrived, taller than most hopes and trembling slightly as if it knew something about balance. I had learned how to stand inside the evening, like a letter that refuses to be opened until later. And though my name was announced during a toast as a tireless supporter, the applause sounded like the ocean from very far away, where you can't tell if the waves are welcoming or warning. Near the end, while the young clustered wherever the music overheated and the older people practiced their exits with coats half on, I collected my cardigan and the small clutch with my lipstick and the envelope with the emergency cash a woman brings to every event where someone else is in charge. And I told myself I would go home without ceremony because quiet departures are the last dignity left to us on nights like this. I could have done it too. I could have slid into the hallway and passed the framed seating chart and the pillars wrapped in fairy lights and into the honest night where the air doesn't lie. But the universe has a sense of timing, and sometimes the clock decides to say what no one else will. And so, when I reached the glass doors, the venue manager materialized from that backstage world where all events are held together with pins and instructions. A man with careful shoulders and a binder that looked heavier than paper, and he said my name with a courtesy that made me brace for impact and asked softly enough that it didn't bleed if I had a moment to review something about the final numbers before I left. He led me away from the music and laughter toward the corridor that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and hot wiring, all those hidden arteries that keep a celebration beating while no one asks where the blood comes from. And his voice was careful in the way practiced kindness always is when it has to carry bad news without dropping it, and he said he was so sorry to interrupt. But before I left, would I mind reviewing a discrepancy that had surfaced once the last bar package was tallied, and the final floral adjustments were logged by the vendor who had stayed late to collect the rented stands, and the corridor narrowed into an office with a wall calendar full of small X's and a computer screen that glowed too blue and a metal cabinet where contracts settle to sleep until someone wakes them with an uncomfortable question. And he placed a folder in front of me the color of oatmeal and slid from it the neat stack of pages that people trust because paper has the audacity to look honest. And there in the disciplined columns and the machine-calm font, I saw the day I had purchased, rewritten to include things I had never agreed to, upgrades that looked like adjectives until you noticed their prices, an expanded open bar that had flowed, like a river no one intended to dam, a late-night snack station because memories apparently require sliders to be permanent, extra up-lighting to make the room blush more convincingly, gold-rimmed charger enhancement, as if the plates had needed crowns, a string quartet, extension to ceremony prelude, because silence is always the cheapest guest and therefore suspect. And next to each line, a small box marked with initials that resembled mine the way a mirror resembles a window. Similar until you try to step through. He spoke softly while I read, not apologizing for the facts because the facts are stubborn and do not accept apologies, only for the timing. And he said he realized the original agreement had been clear about caps and limits and deposits, and that, earlier in the week, a new set of authorizations had been sent by email from a familiar address with assurances that the mother of the bride would be covering any overages, and that it was all very standard and not to worry because she wants it to be. Perfect. And he used my name again in the present tense, not the past. And I heard how the sentence cut me into pieces. My money, a separate person who could be promised by someone else. My name an instrument that could be played to a different tune. My face still smiling in the photos while the numbers bent behind it like tired dancers. I asked to see the emails. and he clicked with respectful fingers until the screen offered up a thread like a trail of breadcrumbs leading into a forest that had learned to feed on mothers. And there were messages from the account I recognized from years of sending recipes and reminders and weather warnings, except these were short and cheerful and decisive, almost professional in their crispness. Yes, go ahead. Yes, add those. Yes, extend by 1 hour, my mother insists. It's her gift. We will settle at the end. And below the words was the signature line my daughter uses when she wants to look employed by her own life. Bold name, tiny flourish, soft threat. And in a separate scan, the page where initials had been scrawled in a hand that mimicked mine with the same shameless confidence a cheap handbag mimics leather. Close enough for a night, never meant for sunlight. And I let the air move in and out once, twice, 3 times. Because the body understands the math of survival even when the spirit is offended by arithmetic. He pointed to the total in the corner, a sum that had learned how to climb while no one watched, and said that the primary card on file, the one I had used for deposits, had authorized the first sweep and then hesitated at the final pass, that there was a balance he regretted to present, and that they could arrange a payment plan if needed, and the words, if needed, landed too gently for what they were delivering. Because the number did not care about dignity, it cared only about being fed. And I stared at it while the room performed its subtle time tricks, the hum of the little refrigerator growing louder and then soft again, the tick of a wall clock that wanted to be taken seriously, the faint strobe of dance floor lights sneaking under the door to prove the party was still alive and would continue without me just fine. And I had a vision of myself standing up in the ballroom and ringing a spoon against a glass to request the attention of the gathered, to say loudly and with real composure that we had all enjoyed a thing purchased with a name that did not belong to everyone equally, that love had been confused with credit, and that both would now require settlement. And I saw the heads turn toward me with the quick jerk people, reserved for emergencies and gossip, and I felt in my bones the exact weight of the silence that would follow. And I understood why I wouldn't do it, not because I was afraid of their eyes or her fury or the tidy headlines that would form in the minds of those who were waiting for evidence that older women are dramatic when starved of attention, but because I have never wanted to teach my daughter a lesson in public that I had already failed to help her learn in private. So I asked for a pen, and he reached for one shaped like a promise and put it in my hand, and I signed where a person signs when she decides that one more bruise will not be the end of her. And I took my card from my purse the way a person might lower a small boat into an untidy sea, and while the machine thought and paused and then accepted with its impersonal blue approval, I told myself I was paying not to erase the cruelty, but to complete the evidence, to make the paper match the reality. So the record would not lie, even if people did. And when it was done, he tore along a dotted line and handed me copies that looked like cousins of the truth. And he said again how sorry he was, and that he had a mother too. And I believed him because his mouth went a little tight, the way men's mouths do when they look at a woman, their mother's age, and realize the world asks more of her than gratitude. On the way back through the corridor, I passed a mirror that pretended not to be watching, and for a moment I caught the reflection of a woman carrying a slender stack of white rectangles like a box of thin glass. And she was not broken. Not yet. Only crowded in by the borders of the evening and I wanted to take her face in my hands and press it back into the shape of the girl who used to laugh at the wrong time and get away with it because her laughter made other people braver. And then the music swelled and the door opened at my elbow, and the smell of buttercream and fatigue rushed out to greet me. No one saw me return to my table. The candles had puddled into themselves, and the flowers were beginning to slouch in the way of living things that have been asked to be spectacular for too many hours, and I slid the receipt into my clutch next to the lipstick that promises to be called crimson and never fulfills it. And my phone lit up with a message from my daughter that read, "Where did you go?" And then another that said, "We need you for photos." And the need in the sentence felt like a favor, disguised as inclusion. And I typed on my small island of glass that I was in the hallway and would be there shortly. And I stood again because that is the job. And I positioned myself under a chandelier that cast flattering honesty. And I turned my shoulder the way the photographer asked, and I let the room swallow what it had taken, because it had been taught how to do that by people who throw away the box. A gift came in before they have even decided if the gift is theirs to keep. Later, when the last song played and the young achingly beautiful handed the night their shoes and confessed to gravity at last, I felt the receipt burning in my clutch like a coal from a kitchen fire. No one will admit started when a pot was left unattended, and I made my rounds, touched arms, spoke blessings I did not entirely believe, kissed a cheek that smelled of sugar and newness, and when my daughter turned toward me with a face that was a winning photograph already, she said, "Thank you for everything," and the word everything had the shine of a spoon that has been polished for display but never sees soup. And I nodded and told her she looked like the bell of a better church and that I hoped she would ring. And she laughed and said, "Don't be poetic, Mom. Just enjoy." And there it was again, that instruction to be an audience in a room I had purchased tickets to and then been charged for standing in the aisle. Outside, the night had recovered its dignity, and the air felt like a clean page, and I stood a moment with my hand on the cool rail and thought of the ledger now waiting in my bag. Those neat numerals like small soldiers lined up to tell me the war had been over before I noticed we were fighting, and I promised myself that I would not give the story the ending it had requested, where a mother makes a scene or pretends she didn't notice. Instead, I would take my boat of paper home, and I would read it by the patient lamp on the table, and I would circle what belonged to me, not the gold rims or the extra hour or the quartet that became a wallpaper against which my daughter practiced smiling, but the sentences, the signatures, the certainty that someone had decided my name was a useful object, and that I, at last, would decide otherwise. The manager came out after me with my cardigan folded perfectly in a rectangle, human hands doing what they can to improve a night that has lost its manners, and he said there had been a small glitch with the florist's courier, and another form would come to my car alone in heels that had learned, like me, to perform comfort under pressure. And I sat with the door still open and listened to the cicadas argue about summer and thought, with the strange calm that sometimes follows insult, that tonight had been, learned to read absence like weather. A photograph posted to a social account with the caption, "Best day ever," and my face cropped to the edge as if I were a margin note no longer required. A string of thank you texts that thanked everyone who helped, with no mention of the woman who had arranged the seating charts and covered deposit after deposit, and a cousin asking politely at brunch whether I was keeping well, as if I might be an elderly aunt one removes from view because she is inconvenient in the Sunday light. These were not dramatic. They were domestic and therefore surgical. They removed me in increments so small and so tender-feeling that I kept mistaking them for kindness. I told myself I was old, that people make choices about who they put on pedestals, that perhaps my daughter wanted to start a life that looked a certain way, and I had no right to stand between her and her clean lines, and yet the air grew thin around me as if someone had decided to heat the room by degrees and expect me not to notice the slow change. In the kitchen, the labels on the boxes of leftovers changed hands without so much as a question. My name in the vendor contracts shifted to a line that read, "Account authorized by," and then a set of initials that were close enough to mine to be almost kind and almost criminal. And when I called the florist in a voice that tried to be calm and practical, I received a measured apology and the phrase, "We thought you wanted to gift it," like a stone wrapped in velvet, soft to touch, but heavy when you must lift it with your own hands. At home, the couch seems to remember better than the people who sat on it. When I open the old recipe box to the card with the crooked handwriting that says, "For your ginger loaves," my thumb lingers on the smudge where my daughter once smeared frosting and declared it art, and I understand that something else has been smudged out now, a record of ordinary tenderness. The small cruelties multiply because they are permitted. A niece visits and does not sit beside me. Though chairs are abundant, a family group photograph is taken, and later someone says casually that they fixed the composition, which is a polite way of saying they removed people who complicated the frame, and when I raise my hand to speak at a cousin's dinner about something as mundane as the heating bills, the polite conversation runs ahead of me like a train, and I am left standing on the platform watching it recede. Meanwhile, the financial reality that first stung in the manager's office begins to climb its own ladder. Charges appear on statements that limp with tiny fees and late-night orders. A merchant phone rings in the early afternoon and says yes, the I deliver what they have been denying themselves for years. I go to the bank more than once, not because I like their fluorescent patience, but because the paper trail is stubborn, and I need something stubborn in me to answer it. And the bank teller with the paint-stained nails asks if I want copies of the ledgers, and I ask for every single one, even when the clerk's eyes flit to the clock, because asking for copies is the language of someone preparing a defense. The daughter's voice becomes a terrain I no longer recognize. Where there was once a softness that said, "Come here when you were cold," there is a curated brevity designed to protect a new household, and her messages come with layers. At once, apologetic and defensive, a collage of social niceties that somehow manages to misplace the human point of contact that once tied us together. She writes, "We'll settle up when things are calmer," and then posts a vacation photo with the new husband. And the caption, "Finally, time for us," as if the phrase "time for us" contains a small erasure that says us and not us and you. And I feel the air tighten because the promise of a settlement is a placeholder, an IOU, delivered in syllables rather than signatures. Around me, neighbors and old friends begin to behave as if they were waiting for a cue to pick a side, and human beings often choose the path of least conflict, so that the people who used to call and ask after my arthritis now ask instead if I need someone to pick up my mail, a bureaucratic kindness that smells faintly of removal rather than inclusion. And all the while, the house where I spent those years that contained both mistakes and miracles becomes a ledger I am asked to forget. It's mortgage statements folded like instructions I gave without complaint, until one morning I find a note tucked in the daily paper. Can you confirm? The account has been updated. The account. My name is an account. It takes a small, almost comical rupture for me to stop rationalizing. The daughter phones late one night, the tone of voice not angry but strained like a stretched rubber band, and says sharply, "Don't make this into anything." As if my concern were an elegant drama she simply does not have time to attend. To which I reply quietly, "I am not making anything. I am asking you how to read the contracts." And she tells me to speak to her husband, who is better with numbers, and hangs up. The click of his shadow pushing the line down. That night, I sleep poorly, not only because my joints ache, but because memory seems to have been edited without my consent, and the edits are small enough to be plausible until they are not. Friends begin to ask, unbidden, if I feel settled in my decision to move to a smaller place because it might be easier now, and I realize the conversation has been pre-formatted for me as if I live in a screenplay written by people who do not want me to improvise. The escalations keep their promises by being boringly ordinary, and ordinary is the thing that sneaks up like tidewater and removes the shore. There are no violent scenes, no shouting matches on the lawn, only the slow, bureaucratic unmaking of a woman's footprint in the life she sustained, and the cruelty of it is the cruelest kind because it feels practical. Arrangements made for the convenience of others while a life is quietly devalued. And though I rage in private, that rage is disciplined by a lifetime of lessons about propriety and the knowledge that public fury will give them precisely the drama they have been practicing. So I choose instead to set pieces in order. I begin cataloging receipts. I sit with my neighbor who once taught me how to balance a checkbook and refuse small talk until she helps me run the sums. I write down dates and names and phone numbers in a little leather-bound book I had kept for lists of groceries, and now press into service for something larger. And in that small act of pen to paper, I feel a strange and steadying power return to my hands. Because power sometimes arrives, not as a shout, but as a ledger. And when the next polite invitation arrives with a polite preface about how hard it must have been, I will have numbers to match the sentiment and not collapse into the gentle posture they expect of me any longer. I woke the next morning with the kind of clarity that doesn't feel like courage so much as a correction, as if the room had been gently rotated overnight and now the corners met where they were always meant to. And I made coffee in the quiet kitchen and spread the papers across the table like a map a woman draws when she finally admits she has been walking in circles. I took the folder from the venue, the bank printouts with their polite fonts, the florist's invoice with its cheerful clip art, leaves, and I added to them the notepad where, in the restless hours, I had listed names and dates and little arrows that tried to turn chaos into a sequence. And as the steam rose from the chipped mug that has outlived 2 addresses and a marriage, I began to read my life not as a set of grievances, but as a set of entries, line by careful line, and the act itself quieted me. Because there is a special hush that comes when you replace the word why with the word how and decide to walk the length of it without drama. By 10, I had washed my face, buttoned the blue cardigan that earns its keep, and taken the bus into town because the bus forces patience, and I needed a rhythm that could steady my hands. At the bank, I asked for a printout of every transaction connected to the wedding accounts, and I watched the young teller's practice cheer falter into something like respect when she realized I was not here to be shepherded, but to shepherd myself. And when she offered to highlight suspicious items, I told her very gently that I would be the one deciding what qualified as suspicious today, and she smiled the way people smile when they remember their grandmother raising her voice only once, precisely, and never forgetting the reason. I sat at a side table near the brochure rack and circled charges like a schoolteacher correcting a paper, not because I wanted to scold the child, but because the work itself mattered, and somewhere between extension fee, quartet, and premium open, bar overage, I felt a small door click open in my chest. Not the dramatic door of sudden rage, but the practical door of a woman who has found the room where the tools are kept. I called the florist from the bench outside under a tree that shed its leaves with an honesty I envied, and asked, without apology, to hear the authorization on file for the extra arrangements. And when the woman read the line aloud that said, "Mother insists on perfection," I said, as one might when correcting a pronunciation that has been wrong too long, that the mother in question had insisted on boundaries, and that future authorizations would require her living voice, not a forwarded rumor in her name. And I let the silence on the other end make room for the change. I went next to the community legal clinic because a nurse once told me the most valuable thing in a city is a door you can walk through without paying to be believed. And in a small room that smelled faintly of toner and bravery, I met a woman with silver hair and a steady pen who listened without theatrics. While I explained the handwriting that mimicked mine, the emails that borrowed my voice without asking to wear it, the balance that slid across my threshold like a stranger who had been told. The house was empty. She asked concise questions, and, more important, she waited for my answers to arrive at their own pace, and together we wrote letters that were not threats, but borders, firm and kind as a well-laid fence. To the venue, to the florist, to the coordinator, we revoked any standing assumption that my name could be stretched to fit any plan that wanted to feel generous, and we requested copies of the original authorizations and the IP addresses of the emails for our records. And with every sentence I signed, something that had been asking for my permission to collapse decided to sit up straight again. On the way home, I stopped at the office supply store, not for drama, but for supplies. A ledger with thick paper that requested a good pen, a packet of tabs the color of late fruit, a file box that promised to bear weight without complaining, and a stamp pad because I wanted the old-fashioned certainty of an inked mark, the ceremony of witnessing myself. I could have bought a new dress or earrings that pretended to be a new beginning, but I chose instead the grammar of order. And when I laid the ledger on the kitchen table and wrote, in deliberate letters, "This is the account of what was done to my name and what I did with it," I felt a small, fierce pleasure, unlike any I have allowed myself since the days when my daughter was a child, and I could fix her world with a needle and 10 quiet minutes. In the afternoon, because the body needs proof as much as the mind, I walked to the shoreline and let the wind rearrange me without asking me to be pretty about it. And I stood on the wet sand with my shoes dangling from the fingers that have folded 1,000 napkins and paid 1,000 bills, and I realized that the shift was not a roar, but a rearrangement. I had been living as if my usefulness were a personality trait rather than a job description, and jobs can be renegotiated or declined. whereas traits are prisons, and I was tired of praising my warden. When I returned, the phone had bloomed with messages. My daughter's impatience perfumed with politeness, a cousin's gossip pretending to be concern, a voicemail from the new husband requesting we be rational and respect process. And for the first time, I did not rush to answer as if the ringing were a fire alarm. I made tea, I placed 3 letters in stamped envelopes, revocations, requests, boundaries, and I set a 4th sheet aside, addressed to my daughter. But I did not write it yet because I had finally remembered the rule I forgot when she turned beautiful and I turned useful. Truth delivered too soon is just another performance for the person who insists on being the main character. And I wanted to write not to be seen, but to see clearly. That evening, I performed a small ceremony that no one will post or applaud, but that shifted the weight of the day from my shoulders to the page. I emptied my wallet of loyalty cards I no longer wished to own. I cut in half the secondary card that had been attached to accounts others felt free to decorate with my generosity, and I placed on the windowsill a single slip of paper on which I had printed, in the neatness of a schoolgirl determined to be taken seriously, "No more authorizations by rumor." And the ridiculousness of it made me laugh out loud, a sound I had not heard from my own mouth in weeks, and that laughter felt like the hinge on which the door truly swung. I slept without the television for the first time since the wedding, and in the morning, I woke to my ledger waiting on the table like a reliable friend who has no talent for flattery and every talent for showing up. And I began the day not by asking what I could do for them, but by asking what I could do for the woman whose hands had been misnamed for too long. I wrote to the clinic attorney to authorize a fraud alert that was not vindictive but protective. I called the credit company and rehearsed the sentence, "No, I did not," until it fit in my mouth like my own name again. I printed the florist's revised statement and clipped it to the first with a note that said, "Progress." And then, because I wanted something that wasn't paper to carry the change, I baked a pan of ginger loaves from the smudged card in the tin. And as the kitchen filled with the old scent of winter mornings when my daughter still believed sweetness arrived from labor, I understood that the midpoint of a woman's story is not where she discovers she is strong. Strength is dull news by now, but where she discovers she can refuse to spend it on rituals that do not include her by name. I did not tell anyone what I had done. Instead, I wrapped 2 loaves in brown paper and took one to the neighbor who once taught me the arithmetic of household steadiness, and left the other on my own counter as an offering to the version of me that had stayed alive through the boredom and the insult. And when the phone rang again, I let it gather its own history of unanswered rings, because I had finally remembered the difference between being needed and being used. And I wanted to hear the silence learn my new shape before I let words back in. The quiet did not last long, because quiet never does when people are used to finding you by the sound of your footsteps. And the first disturbance arrived, dressed as courtesy. A message from my daughter that began with "Hope you're well," and ended with a reminder that families handle misunderstandings privately, which translated to, "Withdraw the letters and we can pretend a different story together." I read it twice at the kitchen table, with the ledger open and the last square of ginger loaf softening on my tongue, and for a suspended moment I could feel the old gravity tug at me, the instinct to be the one who keeps things simple so other people can stay glamorous. but I had already learned to replace why with how. So I set the phone face down and let the words live without me for an afternoon. The second was under a great deal of stress, and that people say things when they are overwhelmed, and that mothers are the only ones who can absorb that kind of static without damage. And I listened because listening is a habit I have to break deliberately. And when she finally stopped to breathe, I said plainly that absorbing static is how radios die, and that I would be grateful if she did not use the word compromise for situations in which only one person retreats and the other plants a flag. That night, there was a paper letter in the mailbox, the kind with a professional letterhead that believes itself to be neutral, from a lawyer who has a talent for making demands sound like protection, asking me to consider rescinding my inquiries with vendors to avoid escalating tension that could become harmful to the family brand. And I noticed the dreadful little phrase family brand, as if the people I fed and bathed and took to emergency rooms had been repackaged into something with a logo, the names of storms, and made myself a cup of tea that tasted like staying. The next day, the pressure learned to walk on two legs, because the new husband called with the kindly impatience of someone who assumes negotiation will end at the point where his patience runs out. And he said he wanted to clear the air and make sure we were all aligned on the narrative going forward, a sentence that tells you everything you need to know about a man who believes stories must be aligned like teeth. And I said, the narrative I am aligned with is the one that prints on paper and says who authorized what and when. And he laughed that small, paper-thin laugh men use when they have discovered an obstacle they intend to charm into a doormat, and offered to sit down with me to go over the complexities of the finances. And I said, there is nothing complex about the sentence, I did not sign that. And he said there is also nothing complex about the sentence, we all benefited. And I realized that this would not be a conversation that put anything back, only a conversation that learned the shape of my spine. I hung up with my breath steady and my hands warm. And because I do not want to live in the administrative wing of my own heart, I went to the market for plums and parsley. Small mercies that keep a woman honest. And on the way back, I met my neighbor, Joan, who sees more than she says, and she asked carefully if everything was all right, because she had run into Emma at the store, and Emma had been telling a version of events where I had gone too far with paperwork. And I felt the old humiliation try to rise, but it wasn't humiliation anymore. It was information. So I told Joan that I was in the process of rescuing my name from an unfortunate assignment, and that if anyone asked, she could say I was well, very well in fact, and learning how to own the word no without whispering it. That evening, the air changed. A pressure shift that told me rain was on the way. And with the first television drops came the first public post. A smiling photograph with a caption about gratitude and a paragraph about elderly relatives who can be unpredictable when stressed. And there it was, the gentle shove toward the narrative that would make them saints and me weather. And for a minute, I felt the unfairness of it like a physical misalignment. And then I remembered the legal clinic woman's pen moving without apology across the page, and I turned off the screen and opened my window to the honest sound of rain instead. The messages multiplied like mushrooms because people love a tidy controversy. A cousin texted to tell me she had heard I was struggling and that she was praying for my spirit of peace, which is lovely when meant and cruel when not. And an old friend forwarded a thread with the question, "Are you okay?" embedded like a needle in cotton, and I replied only to the friend, because choosing your replies is the first exercise of a new muscle. And I wrote that I was not in danger, I was in process, and that this, too, is a kind of peace. Then came the knock at the door that does not belong to friends. The paired silhouettes of two people in business casual who introduced themselves as from a firm retained by my daughter and her husband, with a mandate to facilitate communication. And they had forms in their clipboards and empathy printed on their foreheads. And they wanted to know if I would consent to a conversation facilitated by them for the sake of closure. And I pictured a room where apology is negotiated into a shape that flatters the camera. And I told them calmly that closure was not a service I required from third parties, and that in my house, closure is achieved by folding clothes and writing letters and drinking tea I choose for myself. And they said they would note my refusal and offered a card, and I did not take it because my hands have other work to do. After that, the house felt different in the evening, not hostile, but as if it had begun to listen with me, and I moved from room to room with the slow certainty of someone taking inventory after a storm, checking the window latches, testing the lamp. Chains, opening drawers to confirm that everything that should be there still was. The ledger took its place on the end table beside the chair, where I sometimes fall asleep without intending to, and I looked at what was inside, not to rehearse grievance, but to rehearse reality. And the repetition made me strong, the way a woman becomes strong. Lifting a grandchild, the muscle thickening in ways no one sees from a distance. It was around then that Emma switched tactics, shifting from public prettiness to private pressure. And she left me a voice message full of quivering sincerity in which she said she had never meant to hurt me, and that she was drowning, and that I had to stop before I ruined the first months of her marriage, and the words had the same uneven edges as her childhood apologies when she was caught lying about homework. And I sat at the table and let the message play twice so I could hear the woman and the girl braided together, and then I placed my phone on the ledger like a paperweight, and I wrote a sentence on a card. It is not an emergency simply because someone else decided it should be. And I pinned it to the corkboard with the tiny brass tacks I keep in a jar from a time when the world believed women were capable of hanging their own reminders. The next day, I carried my calm into the clinic again and signed the request to begin a small claims process for amounts that were not negotiable by tone. And together, we assembled a packet that did not need anyone to clap for it. And while I was signing, a man in the waiting area approached with the careful posture of someone who remembers his mother's rules, and he said he was the venue's night manager, and that he had seen me that evening and wanted to tell me, for whatever it was worth, that I had behaved with dignity, and that he had told his team to triple-check authorizations after that because he had a mother, and he would not want her name to be used as currency. And I nodded and felt the interior weather shift slightly toward blue. That small pocket of blue was tested sooner than I expected, because the husband arrived in person, all dark coat and the kind of cologne that ought to be applied with a board vote, and he stood on my porch as if he were here to sell me a better version of my own past, asking politely to come in and get ahead of this. And I looked at him with the tired kindness I reserve for men who think their clarity is a gift, and told him we could speak on the step where the air could help both of us. Behave. And he said they were willing to reimburse some of the confusion if I agreed to sign a statement accepting that miscommunications had occurred on all sides. And I let him finish because interrupting a man is a greater sin in his church than the lie he brings with him. And then I told him that my acceptance was not for sale, and that he had misapprehended the nature of the ledger I had been keeping, which existed so that I would not be browbeaten into the soft velvet of compromise, and his merely arriving at my own doorstep with my own name in my hands, and I asked him to leave then because he had already overstayed the politeness that brought him. After the following morning, the storm I had been tasting finally broke, not in the sky, but in the newspaper, where a small local piece quoted a family source discussing my well-being and asked the public to respect privacy during a sensitive time. And the photo they used was from 5 years ago, when my hair still made promises it could keep. And I wanted to be offended, and instead I laughed, because something about their hunger for control had tipped from elegant to ridiculous, and because once I went to grandson, taller than heartbreak and thinner than childhood, standing with his hands in his pockets like a boy waiting to be called inside, and he did not ask if he could come in. He waited to be invited, and when I opened the door wider, he stepped over the threshold as if it were a line in the sand he had chosen to cross. And he said, "I thought you might need some company that doesn't ask you for anything." And we sat at the table and ate plums and said almost nothing, and the not saying was a bridge no one else had thought to build. And when he left, he put his hand on my shoulder in the old way that says, "I see you in the room, not just the cost of the room." His visit made the next round of calls easier to bear, because they came like weather again. A storm cell of family members who had not telephoned in months suddenly discovering my number as if it were a moral exercise, asking for my side with the greedy politeness of people who enjoy their own fairness. And I gave them the most boring side, the side made of dates and amounts and signatures, and they glazed like pastries and changed the subject, because the truth has fewer adjectives than gossip and therefore fewer fans. I knew the pressure had reached its peak when Emma finally arrived herself, not with sunglasses and a plan, but with bare eyes and the kind of posture people adopt when they want to be forgiven without having to say why. She stood in the doorway and said, "Mom," in a tone that used to unlock me. And then she started to say she was sorry in 5 different tenses without actually landing on the present. And somewhere in the middle, she said the sentence that clarified everything. "I didn't think you would mind." And it rang like a bell in a church I no longer attend. And I said quietly that the point is not whether I minded, the point is whether I mattered. And the way her face shifted told me she had never been asked to answer that question. Before, not by me, because I had never posed it, and not by herself, because she had never needed to. And we stood there for a long moment, 2 women evaluating an empty shelf where something should have been. She cried then, and I fetched a towel because tissues are for illusions, and she asked what I wanted. And it was the simplest question in the world and the hardest, because for years I had trained myself not to want in a way that needed anyone else, to change. "Watch me tie mine." And she looked at the ledger on the table and then at the envelopes addressed in my hand. And for the first time in months, she did not try to rearrange the room with her voice. She sat, and we breathed the same air without, pretending it smelled like forgiveness. She left without promises, because promises made in doorways are just the air practicing, and I stood with my hand on the frame after she went and felt something unclench that had been clenching since the manager slid the folder toward me, and I knew that the pressure would return because that is what pressure does. But I also knew that my house had learned a new gravity and would hold me even when the weather had other ambitions, and I turned on the lamp, set another letter on top of the stack, and began to write in a hand that did not shake. I woke on the day itself, before the gulls began their rewrites of the morning, and I dressed with the same careful economy I used when I was a young woman going to interviews I could not afford to lose, not because I wanted the room I was heading toward to like me, but because I wanted it to have no work left to do, inventing me. And I placed the ledger in my bag like a small heart that had finally remembered its job, and I tucked the letters from the vendors and the bank behind it with the tidy ferocity of someone packing provisions for a crossing. The courthouse was nothing romantic, just a stack of municipal compromises that smelled faintly of copier toner and wet umbrellas. And in that smell, I found a strange courage because it meant other people had also come here to move their lives along with paperwork instead of tears. So I checked in at a window where a woman with a pin shaped like a sun slid me a number and a glance that said she had mothers too. And then I sat in a row of chairs that warmed to the small weather of waiting, and I breathed the way my neighbor Joan had taught me after her surgery. Long in and longer out, which tricks the body into thinking the ship has found a friendlier current. When they called my name, the consonants sounded newly oiled, and the mediator, a woman with kind eyes and the posture of a former teacher, led us into a room that refused to be dramatic. Gray carpet, gray table, a small vase that had decided one flower could be enough. Emma was already there with her husband and a man in a suit that looked like a firm handshake. And my daughter's face was the one she wears at airports when flights are delayed, flexible enough to pretend she isn't furious, and I felt the old tug, the reflex to soften my own features so her day could find its light again. But I kept my expression level, not mean and not forgiving, simply even, like the edge of a ruler laid on a desk to stop a curling paper from telling lies. The mediator asked us to speak in turn and to keep our voices low enough to respect the building we were in, and I wished someone had taught us that lesson in our kitchen 20 years ago, and then it began. The slow unfurling of versions, the husband offering words like miscommunication and shared benefit, and the lawyer adding the balm of unfortunate oversight, and my daughter, my girl, weaving apology through the warp of something closer to salesmanship, saying that she had always assumed I wanted the night to be beautiful, and that surely beauty costs what it costs, and that she had been overwhelmed, and the vendors had been persuasive, and everyone thought I had authorized it because I always had before, which was the most honest thing, said so far and the most dangerous, because there is a special kind of theft that dresses itself in the clothing of precedent and calls itself reasonable. When it was my turn, I did not speak about the easy parts of pain, the humiliation and the loneliness, and the way a word like useless can wring the ribs for weeks. I opened the ledger and became practical, as if I were standing at a stove stirring a sauce that would split if I indulged myself, and I read out dates and amounts and the exact language of the original contract, and I pointed to the emails with their cheerful lies and to the initials that pretended to be my hand. And I said, without trembling, because I had already done that at home, that I did not sign these authorizations, that the account in my name had been used because people were accustomed to my yes being a background noise and not a decision, and that I was not here to be mourned or managed, but to correct the record and to be repaid. And I laid a single sentence in the middle of the table like a key. The problem is not extravagance. The problem is consent. Something my consent in writing or in voice for any of the items in dispute And Emma tried to find a route through the thicket, and could not. And for the first time, she said the small, adult truth that had been waiting for her since childhood. No. And the room relaxed by a fraction, because rooms like it, when people finally begin to use the right words. The negotiation that followed had all the elegance of plumbing. It was not meant to be beautiful, only functional, and I learned to love its clank and hiss in real time. The husband made a proposal that was careful with adjectives and careless with numbers, and I replaced it with numbers and no adjectives. The lawyer offered a timeline that sounded like mercy, and I countered with one that sounded like math. The mediator kept us moving along the stream bed of the issue when we tried to clamber up. The sentimental banks to argue about mothering and loyalty and who cried where, and after 2 hours in which I did not once apologize for preferring facts, we reached the only arrangement worthy of paper, a consent judgment filed that day for a contact in the presence of a third party who could spell witness, and a requirement that credit companies and vendors receive copies, so the rumor that I was a bottomless well would not make the rounds wearing new lipstick. I signed first because I wanted my name to arrive in that document before anyone had time to reconsider the physics of the afternoon. And I watched my daughter read the page with the solemn attention she used to give to cereal boxes, looking for the prize. And when her eyes reached the paragraph that said what it said, without embroidery, she inhaled the way people do when they feel the earth adjust under their feet. And she signed. And her husband signed too, with a productive grimness. And the lawyer— It would have been enough to rise then and go home to tea and the ledger's new, contented weight. But I had brought another letter, folded so flat it could have been a blade, and I walked 2 floors up to the clerk who handles small and sturdy miracles, and filed a sworn statement revoking any standing permissions on my accounts and affirming that any future attempts to use my name would be treated as fraud. And the clerk stamped it with a thunk that sounded like a door closing softly, but forever. After that, I crossed the street to my bank and sat with a manager who has the good fortune to have been raised by a woman who keeps lists, and together we closed the secondary card that had been a leash disguised as trust. And we established alerts that would make my phone behave like a loyal dog, barking at the mail slot whenever a stranger tried to slip something through. And I set up a new small account with a new small purpose to fund anything that I decided made me more myself. And into it. Plastic and triumph. And outside the wind had changed from courthouse to seaside, and the clouds had the friendly undersides of laundry hung out to dry. On the determination like a scarf, and when I reached my stop I felt taller. Although I know bones do not lengthen at my age, it was simply the removal of the stoop that false gratitude carves into you. In the kitchen, I placed the new documents underneath the ledger, and I wrote on the first blank page in a hand steadier than proof. Today, I returned my name to myself. And then I made a call. I had been postponing, not out of fear, but out of a wish to make the call, and that time, and then said very quietly that she did not know who I was being just now. And I told her the truth that made the day worth every step, that I was being her mother at last, the kind who teaches a lesson by doing the thing in front of you until you can see how it is done. And I hung up not to punish, but because the conversation had reached the period it had been missing for years. I slept that night with the window open and the ledger closed, and I dreamed nothing dramatic, only a recurring image of a door that opens inward and then outward and then inward again, as if to prove it belongs to both motions. And when I woke, before the gulls, I did not rehearse defenses or invent speeches or reread the old messages for poison. I made tea, and I ate the end of the ginger loaf, and I felt the quiet gather in the room, not as a pause before the next demand, but as the new shape of my days. And I understood in a way that no courtroom could certify that the act could not be undone, that even if payments failed, or relatives convened, or posts proliferated like ivy on an abandoned fence, the hinge had turned, and the door would not return to the frame it once tolerated. In the weeks after the papers were filed and the calls thinned into the occasional polite weather report, my life settled into a silence that did not accuse me, a silence with windows that opened easily and a table that kept its promises, and I found that ordinary tasks took on the dignity I had been starving them of. The laundry folding with that small snap of clean cloth, the kettle breathing when it was ready, the floor giving softly under my steps, as if the house had decided I was not a guest, but the reason it was standing. I kept the ledger on the shelf now, reachable but no longer stationed like a guard, and when envelopes arrived with repayments that looked less like apologies than arithmetic, I endorsed and filed them without ceremony, because ceremony belongs to births and weddings that remember who paid for the chairs, not to the return of what should never have been taken. And on certain afternoons, I walked along the Strand where the sea rehearses the same lesson every day, that it can come forward without asking permission and also go back without leaving an apology. And I watched gulls edit the shoreline, and I thought about the way my daughter's voice had sounded on the phone when she realized a door had closed, and the hinges would not shame me into reopening it, low and bewildered and briefly honest. And I wished her a future where honesty did not scare her as much as need did. Kieran visited on Saturdays when his shift allowed, tall and careful like boys who have learned to carry their tenderness where it won't be confiscated, and he would bring something small that meant he had been thinking. A notebook with lines I could find with my tired eyes. A jar of the jam I used to make in a kitchen that no longer misunderstands me. And once he brought a photograph he had printed from an old roll. The two of us sitting cross-legged on the floor with a birdhouse between us and paint on our knuckles. And he said he had always liked that day because no one told us to hurry. And I put the picture on the bookshelf between the ledger and a small book of poems, so the old and the new could supervise each other. And when he left, I did not cry because leaving is not always a wound. Sometimes it is simply the continuation of distance that knows how to be kind. Emma wrote one more letter in her round, earnest hand, not to renegotiate, but to narrate the weather of her days, a job she liked sometimes, and a marriage learning the choreography of two different hungers. And the last lines were a question that did not demand an answer. She asked what I was reading and whether I had seen the moon that week, because even in the city she could not ignore it. And I put the paper aside and went out into the yard and stood with my head tipped back until the sky agreed to hold still, and I decided that some questions are a kind of apology, and that the reply they deserve is a life lived in a tone that does not punish. So I wrote back 3 days later, slowly, telling her about the tidiness of winter light, and the neighbor's lemon tree that refuses to quit, and the book of poems, where one line said that dignity is just breath with memory, and I did not speak of the ledger or the money or the courtroom that had smelled like toner and deliverance, not because I was pretending the past was soft, but because our future would not be built from the pages that recorded the harm. And I signed it with my whole name, the one I chose to keep. When the last payment arrived, ordinary as any letter, the amount accurate to the cent, I held it a moment, as if listening for the echo of all the versions of me it had tried to pass through without asking. and then I walked to the bank, where the young teller with painted nails had become a woman whose respect does not depend on how quickly I understand their machines, and I placed the check in the small account I had made for the exact purpose of reminding myself that money can be a yes to the sell. On the first truly clear morning of spring, I baked the ginger loaves and took one to Joan, the neighbor who never asked for the gossip, but always remembered the date I said I would do the hard thing. And we ate slices too thick to be delicate, while she told me about her garden's temper, and I told her about how the sea had become my coach in ordinary courage. And when we had finished, she handed me an old fountain pen that had belonged to a teacher who refused to grade papers in red because she did not think shame taught as well as revision. And I took it home and copied into my ledger. Not the debts and credits, but a single sentence in a slow, careful script that looked like prayer without the begging. I do not need them to be sorry for me, to be free. Near dusk, when the window glass holds a version of you it is willing to show you gently, I sat at the table where I had once opened envelopes like threats and wrote a letter I will likely never send, addressed to any woman who finds herself signed for without being asked, and I told her what the day felt like when the door finally swung in the direction you choose. Not a trumpet or a crowd or a headline, just the clean click of a latch and the soft astonishment of your own shoulders lowering, and I wrote that there will be people who mistake your calm for cruelty because they have only ever met you in the language of service, and you will be tempted to translate yourself back into a dialect that pleases them. But please don't, because the moment you refuse to sign by rumor is the moment the room learns your correct name. And I ended with a small instruction that has saved me more than once. Turn toward the ordinary and do it on purpose. Make the tea. Open the window. Choose the coat with deep pockets. Keep the ledger but move it to the shelf. And when the phone rings, let it ring until it sounds like something that belongs in another house. And when you are ready, answer only to yourself and to those who have learned to ask. And if you need proof that you are allowed to begin again without permission, look for the woman by the sea in the navy coat. She is me, and she is still here, and so are you.